Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first 2019 presentation of the WCEG, the Worldwide Community Empowerment Group. This is your talk radio host, Reverend Diane Doherty, and we are taking a stand again this year on many issues that relate to the wonderful energies we're throwing back into the universe to bring about justice, peace, and community. You are listening to WCEG Talk Radio, and you can go on wcegtalkradio.com to join us. You can also like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. We even have an Instagram. We have an Instagram. You can follow us on Instagram at WCEG_talk_radio.
Hello?
Hello.
Hey, how do I listen on online? The live stream's down.
Oh, your live stream is down. Oh, who's speaking?
We just started, that's why.
Oh.
My name is Paul.
Hi, Paul. We just started. That's why it's down. Do you have a question for us? Glad to have you here.
No, I just was trying to figure out how to hear.
Oh, great. Well, we're on now. You can see it. I see it on our screen. And I'm presenting today Daniel Blackman, who is, in my mind, one of the greatest young adults. I'm naming it. I'm calling it for what it is.
Thank you.
In Georgia. And he is making an effort and standing up, taking a stand, because he is going to run for the chairperson of the Democratic Party.
Of Georgia, that's right.
Georgia.
Well, why do you think that position's important?
Well, thank you. I mean, I guess I'm going to jump right in. I think Diana covered that, but over the course of the conversation, I think it's important for me to make everyone that's listening know that the chair of the party, especially if you're a Democrat out there, is going to determine the next several years of our state and is going to have a truly integral role to play in what happens here in Georgia in 2020. So everything from local politics, like the martyr vote that's coming up in March for our brothers and sisters in Gwinnett County, to the presidential election and even beyond. Georgia has a lot of talent, and it's time for us to build that talent, build the bridges that we need, and connect the entirety of our state. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. I hope you continue to listen.
I'd like to.
I will. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Paul. I'd like to talk a little bit about Daniel himself. I met him through the Concerned Black Clergy and also a number of the organizations that I've belonged to. He's just been there front and center.
I've been there for a long time. I think you met me when I was 20.
I can remember that day.
Yeah, it's been a while, so I'm honored to be here.
I was only 40.
Oh, well, there you go.
Not. So Daniel is from Forsyth County, which is amazing in itself.
Well, no, actually, I'm from Columbus, Georgia.
Oh.
I've lived in Forsyth County for 7 years now, but I'm a military kid. I was born in Boston, Massachusetts. My father was a United States Army Ranger, which moved us from Boston to Vicenza, Italy, and then we were deployed from Vicenza in 1988, and I moved to Columbus, Georgia, where I went to middle school, elementary school, high school. I mean, I basically, my roots and my heart is in Columbus, Georgia, and Muskogee County, so a long story.
Love it. I did not know that.
Yes, ma'am.
When our paths crossed, you were vying for a position at Forsyth County.
Yeah.
And I was absolutely astounded that you would even stand up, because when I moved here in Forsyth County, I was frightened to death because the Ku Klux Klan held a rally.
Yeah.
And I'm from the north. I was not familiar with. I don't have that DNA that talks about racism as it has been experienced in the South. It has been a total learning experience. So to see Well, I heard Daniel Blackman was going to run, but I didn't know you were actually a black man.
Yeah.
And that raised my eyebrows. So why did you? Why have you stepped up? Is this a something that has been moving inside of you?
I mean,
for a long time.
Yeah, I don't think I ran for state senate in Forsyth County knowing that I was the first black person. I mean, it was something where you might have thought about it. I knew about the march Hosea Williams did in 1987. I had found out about the show after declaring that Oprah did. So there's a lot of history in Forsyth County that I didn't know. When my wife and I moved,
Ignorance is bliss.
Ignorance is bliss. You're right. And I think when I moved up there initially, we saw the schools, and some of our friends that we had known over the years had decided to move further north, just so happened to have been South Forsyth. And it was an area that I immediately got involved with the local Democratic Party. There were great people up there that were doing tremendous work, like Wilma Turner and Melissa Klink and different folks that were really, building the infrastructure. And I saw a place there for me in the county. And we had a state senator named Michael Williams who was running for, who was the sitting state senator. And I decided that he needed to be challenged. And that's what we did.
Wow. What you named a number of people and used the word infrastructure, and I really want you to get into this in more depth. But one of the writings that you have on your blog, and it's really a great website that he has, Daniel Blackman. It's easy.
Thank you. We try to keep it simple.
But you talked about developing infrastructure and also about this really excellent concept that I want to really address, which is the 5 Georges.
That's right.
I think that is really a clarifying introduction into where the Democratic Party is going.
Yeah.
So can you explain the 5 Georges?
Yeah, of course. I mean,
It's called the 5 Georgia Plan.
The 5 Georges plan is a really simple.
And is this your plan, or is this the Democratic?
This is my plan. The concept of 5 Georges is a known concept. We normally, when I say we, most people in the state are familiar with the inside the perimeter and the outside the perimeter.
That's right.
What most people don't realize is that if you're not outside the perimeter, meaning that you're not in the counties that touch the metro Atlanta region, a lot of folks haven't been to coastal Georgia, with our friends that are in Chatham County. A lot of folks have not been all the way down to South Georgia, where, our brothers and sisters in Lowndes County are, and different areas like Vidalia, Georgia. I'm from Columbus, Georgia. You look around the totality of our state. There's a coastal aspect of our state. There's a North Georgia aspect, which includes the mountains. There's a middle Georgia. There's rural Georgia. There's so many aspects of our state. And the reason why we decided that a 5 Georges plan was what we needed in the state of Georgia is because when you look at the state, we have been very Atlanta centric, and I love Atlanta. I think Atlanta is a great city, and I think we should replicate in a lot of other cities around the state what Atlanta has been able to do well. But in that same respect, a lot of voices of people in rural Georgia and areas like Macon, Bibb County, and where I live in Forsyth, we've unfortunately written it off. And the reason why I think is because we've seen those places as unwinnable. And when you look at counties around the state that haven't performed well democratically or might not have the fundraising apparatus that Atlanta has, they tend to be neglected. And we felt that we wanted to make a plan that was all inclusive of everyone, no matter what corner of the state you live in or which one of the 159 counties in Georgia you resided. We wanted you to feel like you were part of the vision we had for the future of the state of Georgia. Well,
my biggest question for you then is one of the issues, especially when David Perdue got seated, was that his campaign went to those 5 Georges, but dismissed the larger cities.
Well,
and he won.
Yeah.
But he one of the main draws was racism. How do you, as a Democratic Party chair, address racism that is so endemic in the outskirts?
Well, there's two parts to your question. One, I think is very important and critical for Democrats and everyone around the state to understand that the way we've organized traditionally as a Democratic Party has been at the county level. You know, we have tried to focus on our Fultons and our DeKalbs and Gwinnett's and, you know, Liberty County areas like that. So before we can talk about race, we have to look at the way in which the Republicans have positioned themselves. They organize from a precinct level, right? So while we're trying to organize whole counties, they went and they organized by precinct at the local level.
What's a precinct?
A precinct is where an individual would go to vote. So for instance, if you live in a county, you have voting precincts where you would go to vote, and those precincts individually are just cut out in that particular county or the city that you live in. So before we can even talk about race, we have to look at the apparatus that has been in place. So I think when you go back to 2002, when Governor Barnes, when the last time we had a statewide Democrat in office, we had an apparatus where we were able, in a lot of places in the state of Georgia where Democrats had traditionally done well, we thrived in those areas. Well, the Republicans basically caught onto our playbook, and they actually went into the places that we neglected. And when you talk about race, I don't think that there's any way, and I can't speak for Purdue, but when you look at what Trump has done in 2016, and when you look at what Michael Williams, who I ran against, did with his deportation bus, I think Republicans have not just used race, but they've used fear. They've tried to paint this picture with bills like 287G that counties like Hall County has enforced, or, you know, a young man named Eduardo who is currently serving a sentence. He's not even sentenced yet, but he's, you know, getting ready to be deported. You got to look at these counties and why Republicans are using race or immigration to drum up their base. And I think Democrats have to do a better job of telling the other side of that story and standing on the issues that we say we defend.
I like the idea of standing on the issues that you defend.
Yeah.
Education is one of them. I was privileged to work with the Opportunity School District Georgia Coalition for Public Education.
Cordelia Turner is a good worked hard on the front lines of that, and a lot of friends around the state. So thank you.
And I think one of the things we found was when we went around and gave people the issues, and we went through school boards, as well as superintendents, and kind of focused on the structures that were already there, bringing information and facts. And once people got the information and the facts, that was not something that they wanted to start another bureaucracy. Mm-hmm. So education is just really important.
It's critical.
It's critical. And so are the other issues that you're relating that you're about to focus on.
Yeah, well,
other than education, what are the other issues that Democrats are really going to focus on?
So when we talk about issues with the Democratic Party, we have to look at the issues that we vote on, that we galvanize our base around. So education, criminal justice reform, which in Georgia, 88% of our prison population reaches the third grade level, right? So when you're looking at these new bills that our legislature is going to be looking at, like medical marijuana in the state of Georgia, we now have to look at, you know, low-level drug offenders, and if incarcerating them is going to be something that we focus on, or are we going to work to reform the criminal justice system so that we can make it better and more equitable? One example of this in Georgia was a gentleman named Ted Terry, who was the mayor of Clarkston.
Oh, yeah.
He removed the arrest portion of it and turned it over into a fine for certain quantities of marijuana possession, because we know that, unfortunately, criminal justice has, you know, really been a target against the poor, and the majority of those people targeted are black and brown people. So Democrats have to have on the one side issues that deal with education, criminal justice, you know, affordable housing. You know, there's so many issues that we focus on. Voting rights. Stacey Abrams' campaign was on the front line of the voting rights fight that we just saw. But for my plan in particular, outside of those issues, I believe that two things need to happen. One, Democrats have to be as aggressive outside of an election season as they are during one.
That's right.
So it's not about 2020. What are we doing in 2019 to organize, to build, to educate, and to really position people? So my plan outside of criminal justice reform and education and voting rights deals with, number one, building out a bench. We have a lot of talented people in the state of Georgia. Everyone was not able to be a once-in-a-generation candidate like Stacey Abrams was, right? Like, I mean, we were very fortunate to have someone that was as qualified and as smart and, you know, as you know, decorated as Stacey was. But let's be honest, you know, we've got got a lot of good people around the state of Georgia that don't have the platform that she has, nor have they raised the money that she has. So we want to build up a bench of talent that can focus on not just succession planning, meaning what happens when John Lewis says, hey, you know what, I fought my fight and I'm going to go ahead and hang it up. We've got to have good young people in place to step up and to take on the mantle, right? And it's not just in Atlanta. It's in, Athens, Georgia. We've got folks like groups like Athens for Everyone, and a gentleman named Tim Dennison who's working really hard to change their city council and their commissioners. And, we've got to look around the state and look at three things. One, where are we actually recruiting people from? Two, what are we doing with these young people that supported Jason Carter, who I ran with in 2014, and John Ossoff? These young people that helped get Lucy McBath elected. What are we doing to cultivate that talent and then position that talent to be our next city councilmen and women, and to position them to be potentially statewide candidates? Now, thirdly, outside of recruiting and cultivating that talent, we need to focus specifically on making sure that we're building them, not just to run for office, but to manage our campaigns. One of the biggest flaws the Democratic Party has had in the last few election cycles, in my opinion, is we have focused too much on bringing people from outside the state of Georgia to consult us, right? We're paying people a ton of money that are from Washington, and they're from Ohio, and they're from North Carolina, and I appreciate their insight, but there's nothing like homegrown talent. The best, thing we can grow in Georgia is good people. And when we identify young people at, the Atlanta University Center, at Clark and Morehouse and Spelman, and at Kennesaw and the University of North Georgia and Valdosta State, and, all over the state, when we start identifying talent, drawing from there, but not just saying, hey, volunteer on this campaign, come work in our office, come serve as an intern, come go to the Capitol during the session, and let's show you how bills are written and how we present things and take it back to your campus.
I love that.
So the next two things I'll share with you, because I'm sure we have enough time to do it, but we've got to make sure that one, Georgia in 2020, which we're getting a lot of conversations about, is not only in play, but the one thing that you brought up, David Perdue, earlier, I'm going to bring up two more names, Brian Kemp and Donald Trump. Right. And the reason why I bring up their names is because when Donald Trump came to Georgia, he went to Macon. Right. Donald Trump also went to Valdosta. Donald Trump has also been in Savannah. Now, we don't like the guy, right? And we don't agree with his policies. But until Democrats that come into Atlanta start looking at, Lumpkin County and Hall County and Macon and Columbus, where I'm from, where you have the largest military installation in the world, we've got to start telling candidates, if you want our vote in the state of Georgia, we want you to visit our coastal areas. We want you to visit our rural areas. We want you to visit our mountainous areas, because we have a lot to offer as a state. And if we're going to get beyond that margin, we've got to make sure people embrace the totality of Georgia and not just a few counties.
I think the message is really important. The people liked Trump because he was about jobs, and he was also about getting rid of immigrants.
That's right.
I remember reading, I forget what year it was, when there was a immigration bill that went through the Congress, through both houses, and they were going to deport immigrants right when the peach crop was going to be harvested. Mm-hmm. So they lost the peach crop because, of course, it was like everybody just left Georgia. So they asked the prisoners to pick the crops, and the prisoners said they wouldn't do it. It's too hard work.
Same thing happened in Alabama.
$4.6 billion loss to our economy.
Yep.
So those are the statistics that people don't realize. And I've talked to a number of people who used to be very much against immigrants because they were told they were a bane on the state, a bane on the people.
Yeah.
Until you explain to them that, first of all, they do the work that we're not doing. Mm-hmm. We want our kids to go to college. We don't want our kids to go to the fields. And since this is an agricultural state, we have to deal with this as an issue and see them as human beings, first of all, and secondly, as contributors to our society.
Yeah, rather than embracing policies and the types of Jim Crow, centric rules like 287G, which only 6 states in the United States have adopted, including Georgia and Arizona. It's a policy that's in place for the unfair treatment of our immigrant brothers and sisters that are trying to do the right thing. It allows local police forces to use practices that, in my opinion, are right in line with racial profiling. And we need to address it. And I think that goes to the heart of Democrats. We can't just go to our immigrant brothers and sisters, when it's time to vote and say that we're going to use DACA or whatever as a political football. We've got to say, okay, what are we going to do to educate people now? Because you look at Alabama, they passed the same law to drum up their base for an election year. And what happened to Alabama? Their workers in their rural areas, because they're an agrarian state as well, they lost about 40 to 50% of the folks that worked in these areas. Number two, the school population dramatically decreased because some of these families that were working these jobs trying to get their immigration status, they actually ended up having to pull their children out of schools. So now you have a twofold problem. Number one, we have, to your point about education earlier, we saw the education go down because schools are profit at the local level. You get a certain amount of money per student to be able to help fund the school district, right? So now we're seeing these policies that are not only hateful and in some areas motivated by race, the cost of hate. And there's actually a report that came out that said it costs tens of billions of dollars every year for policies that are driven by fear, hate, or bigotry. And we need to really address that.
That one.
Yeah, I'll find it and send it over to you. But if we're going to thrive in areas like in rural parts of our state, we've got to embrace our immigrant populations, not just because the only jobs immigrants do are in rural areas, because that's not true. That's a misnomer. But there's a large population of these men and women who are trying to find a way to get a path towards citizenship. And they're hardworking men and women, and they have families just like us, and they should be treated in a way that promotes what we say in the state of Georgia on our Great Seal, which is wisdom, justice, and moderation. They need the same respect for those words that sit on our state seal, and it's incumbent upon us to provide that.
I see those movements as invisible hands that want to almost massage Georgia and build it up according to their image.
Yeah.
One of the problems that I have is many times it's corporate businesses that have intentions that are, to me, dishonorable. Mm-hmm. You can use the prison industrial complex as one of the main one of the main causes I have of disruption of our society. I don't think it's in anybody's best interest to put people of color in a prison situation for life. Mm-hmm. I think it demeans the state, and it causes an imbalance in our own society. I also don't believe in profit making for private prisons.
I agree.
I think that takes away from our society. I don't believe in profit making for education. I think that takes away from our society. Yet we don't have the conversation going about the value of public education and public service. It's like this invisible hand is coming and massaging all of the institutions to create private, for-profit organizations. I don't call them institutions. So that if our state is going to be massaged to such a point that happens, I think it's going to be very difficult to go backwards. Yeah. I'm thinking 20, 30 years down. I know the Democrats have a real understanding of being for the people, creating public service for public right. I think it's very difficult to see this invisible hand and to see how much money, time, and effort is being put into pushing this into the fabric of our society.
Yeah, well, I think...
So the Democrats, are very much involved in the privatization of many of our institutions. And I think believe in a diminished public service sector. I don't. I think that needs to grow.
Yeah.
So that we can grow.
Well, I mean, I think you have to look at the most critical part of what you just said, which is I think both parties are, have been perpetrators of gross neglect. And what I mean by that is the issue in America, whether you want to talk about access to public education or public services, it comes down to poverty and access, right? Because, 1.9 million people in the state of Georgia live at or below the poverty level. 45 or 46 million of us in the United States, are living in poverty. And I think until we address the root issue, which is what Dr. King talked about before he died, which is an ability for our folks to really understand that we have to push movement in this country, not just as Democrats, but as grassroots organizers, to really address the root issue, which is equity. And I think when we look at equity, the same way how, kids in the north side of Atlanta or in Buckhead can have access to quality education with whiteboards and iPads, a kid in Southwest Atlanta or in rural Georgia should. The same way how we have high-speed internet in Metro Atlanta,
that's right.
Kids in rural Georgia should have a high-speed internet. How do you do your homework without the internet?
Public education.
Right?
That's public education.
Exactly.
Now, my problem is that this discussion is not being, I've never had it. I've done reading. I've had it individually, but it's not a broad topic. And I don't think that Democrats on the whole raise it as an issue.
Yes, ma'am.
The belief is, and this goes back to neoliberalism, the belief is that inequality is okay. If you can't make it, then you don't get to make it. I don't believe that. I know that a lot of people put a lot of time, effort, and money into my education that was basically free. Mm-hmm. And I really have lived a beautiful life. I can't see that happening to a lot of the kids that I taught these last 15, 20 years.
Yeah.
They don't get what I had, and they're not having it. They're not going to have it accessible. Especially under this influence. The Democratic Party really has to address corporate, for-profit industries to see how much influence they will have within the state. And as a party, how many of the Democrats themselves are part of that for-profit, what do they say, private-public partnerships?
Yeah.
That's fine as long as there's a balance of power.
No, I agree. I don't think a corporation or an individual that can write unlimited checks should be able to dictate the policy, the direction.
But they do.
Well, they do. But, let's be honest. I think that a lot of folks, including myself, that are at the grassroots level that are working hard, we have to do a better job in strengthening and organizing our coalitions because, the same way how Democrats in the state, when folks run for statewide election, I did it in 2014 when I ran for Public Service Commission, and you go out and you ask people for votes, right? But what we're not doing as coalitions and as individuals on the ground is holding them accountable. One of the first lessons that I learned when I came to Atlanta was I met with Maynard Jackson right before Shirley Franklin ran, and Maynard was creating something called the American Voters League, and he said, I want you to be a part of this because we want young people involved in registering people to vote and holding them accountable. And he said, but I want you to come up with some questions. He said, no one should ever come to you and get your vote without you getting something in return. And what Maynard was teaching me at the time was he wanted me to understand fundamentally that in order for us to build candidates that, Shirley's campaign slogan was, if you make me mayor, I'll make you proud, right? But how do you measure what makes her, what you would be proud of, right?
Yes.
So for me, when someone comes to our county or to our district or to anywhere and they say, we want your vote, we need to say, well, you want our vote, but we also want you to do business in our county. When the film industry comes to Georgia, we want to make sure that there are tax credits that are going to our education systems for students and children that want to get into production.
Praise to the Lord.
We need to do a better job of on the ground level with grassroots organizations, because if the Democratic Party does not have safeguards in place, it's no different from any other organization in the United States, right? Any organization that doesn't have infrastructure, safeguards, and accountability is going to be an organization that's susceptible to be infiltrated. And when you think of dark money in politics, one thing that I think we need to really address, which is more of a national issue because it affects all of us, is campaign finance reform. Because we're living in times, not just in Georgia, where you can't even run for president without raising $1 billion. John Ossoff raised $33 million. What if you're a retired school teacher and you're living off of your retirement and you want to go out there and add your voice to a conversation, but you don't know anyone that can write you a $1,200 check? Should you not be able to run for a position? So I think as Democrats, we have to do a better job of addressing the elephant in the room, pun intended, to make sure that when we're putting people out there, they can address the issues, and we can work hard to make sure that everyone is a part of the conversation, but we're holding them accountable. So even if I am so fortunate to become chair, I want to surround myself with people at the grassroots level that we can utilize as somewhat of a democratic, coalition that we build. We don't want to reinvent the wheel and make a new organization. But I would like to set, 1 to 2 meetings per year where we convene every grassroots leader from around the state, and we adjust our agenda based on what we're able to do to support their needs.
I love it. I think one of the images or metaphors that I've been using is the fluidity of parties.
Fluidity is a big word.
It is, or title.
I got you. We're on the same page.
If you look at the Democrats of the, what do they call them, Dixiecrats?
Yeah.
And they switched over to the Republican Party after Lyndon Johnson put in the Voting Rights Act.
64.
1964. So they were the same people. They used to be Democrats, and now they're Republicans. And they switched over because of racism.
Yeah.
Now you have the Republican Party that used to stand for low government, small government, and responsible leadership. And that has all switched. It's fluid. It moves back and forth. So when we talk about you're going to be the Democratic chairperson, what you're doing is you're bringing us back to the original idea of who Democrats are, which is a leadership group that is based in the people's desires and needs.
Yeah. Well, as Democrats, let's be honest. One of the reasons why most of America is in the position that we're in is because of a lack of civility. And a lack of civility, in my opinion, comes from, the miseducation of civics in school. And when you look at the 64 Voting Rights Act, that was something that had taken, 60, 70 years to get to that point.
Absolutely.
What we need to understand is that, and I learned this over the weekend meeting with these great civil rights leaders that I'll talk about later, but they told me that, Dr. King, if it weren't for Montgomery, may not have taken us over the line to get in the Voting Rights Act of 1964, because if you think about it, Dr. King's prominence came after the Montgomery bus boycott. So if you look at 1964, when that bill was passed and when we saw this shift, we go to the point of now speaking about somewhat of an origin of identity politics, right? Now, identity politics isn't something new. I just did this interview on NPR where we talked about modern day identity politics in the previous gubernatorial race.
I read that. And you can all pick it up, by the way, on his website, Daniel Blackman.
Yeah. Well, dpg.vote. They can go there, or danielblackman.com. But the reality of it is, Diane, that when you look at the South specifically, there were certain infrastructures that were set in place that really were predicated on race and the continuance of control. Because in a lot of Southern states, it wasn't just based on these Dixiecrats turning over, but even a lot of liberals. You brought up racism earlier.
Right.
We've got to, as Democrats, we've got to start, really dealing with some of these issues, because some of the same folks that said they were Democrats in South Georgia, they wouldn't put a Stacey Abrams sign in their front yard. So we have to deal with some of the issues that are plaguing our party, and we need to understand that we all have to grow, right? Because I remember making a statement one time that, looking at the way in which when Donald Trump was elected, we saw that 53% of white women voted for Donald Trump, right? And that's a great talking point. But to me, it's also a talking point that can cause division, because even though 43% of white women may have voted for Donald Trump, 47% didn't. right? So we've got to start looking at what is the message that the Democratic Party has to continue to convey to make sure that for folks that are either on the fence or that are voting or being influenced more racially, that means that we have to do a better job. Again, remember I said in and out of an election season. So in times where there's nothing on the ballot, if you want to build civility, well, how about going around to some of these areas that are being impacted right now? You look at Hurricane Michael that just hit, last year. It totally devastated our coastal areas and our rural parts of our state, devastated crops, set farmers back years. Then you look at the tariffs that Trump is putting out. That's hurting folks even more in rural parts of our country. So this is a great time, in my opinion, for Democrats to step in and say, hey, we don't want your vote right now. We just want to make sure you're okay. And in making sure those rural South Georgians are okay, the more we bring them into our fold, the more we can talk to them about equity, the more we can talk to them about education, the more we can talk to them about criminal justice reform. So I think we have to do a better job of, really setting people up, through finding common ground and building bridges instead of walls, because the other side is consistently trying to build walls of division and divisiveness while we're sitting over here saying we don't want a wall. But if you don't want a wall, you need to at least be willing to build a bridge. And I think Democrats need to do a better job of building bridges that allow people to understand the importance of where we are. And that goes directly into what you said about the Dixiecrats, because we had a chance to really address an issue early that we didn't address because we're in the South. And when you look at it right now, the Democratic Party has lost a tremendous number of white men, especially young white men. But here's the thing. We've also lost a lot of black men. Black men.
That's the truth.
In this country and in this state have been neglected in so many ways. And one thing I want to do differently if I become chair of the Democratic Party is I want to address the issue, because you're not going to get more black men to vote for you because you talk about criminal justice reform or unemployment. You have to talk about opportunities. You have to talk about entrepreneurship. You have to talk about things that are going to put our young men in a position to thrive and to be successful so that the next generation can do the things we weren't able to do.
And that's the key.
Yes,
that's
ma'am.
the key to opening the door. A lot of these conversations are circular, and they know it.
Yes, ma'am.
We don't want to hear it anymore. Give me an out.
Yeah.
Give me an out.
And we need to listen. I mean, I think, one thing Democrats can do better is listen to understand and not to respond. A lot of times we go into counties and communities and we're more willing to debate than to solve the problem. And I think it's disingenuous. I live in Forsyth County, Georgia. It took me 3 years to be able to really understand how to even address race and justice from a historical standpoint, because I had to understand the culture. I had to understand not what was being said about the county from folks that didn't live there. I had to sit down and have dinner with some of these folks and talk to them.
Oh, very nice.
And I remember John Lewis said to me, he said that Forsyth County was the one county that they didn't go to during the civil rights movement because, Forsyth was a sundown town.
Yes.
So, when you think about the history of the county, and when I decided to
Explain
run
a sundown town.
A sundown town, if you haven't seen the movie Green Book, you should see it. But a sundown town is somewhere where black folks already could not use certain services, meaning we couldn't stay at certain hotels, we couldn't go to certain gas stations or eat at certain restaurants. Well, if you lived in a sundown town, it upped the ante. In other words, not only could you not be in these areas, but if they caught you out and you were a person of color after the sun went down, there was a very high chance that you wouldn't leave the county the same way you came in, whether that meant you were physically assaulted or killed. And I think we need to understand that the 3 men that were killed in Mississippi years ago, which the movie Mississippi Burning was on, and you had and I know their names, but I don't want to mess it up, but Cheney, Schwerner, and I forgot the last one, but I'm going to remember his name. But when they were killed, they were out in Mississippi and they were caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. And it breaks my heart to know that historically there are a lot of areas that were impacted like this, and people need to know the history so that we can help heal.
Andrew Goodman. And
Goodman he was 21 when he was killed. That was his first trip leaving college, and the first day he got there, he was killed. killed. And, during that time, when they were looking for Andrew Goodman, they found 9 other bodies of black men that had been killed or lynched in that same area. And the reason why that's important as it relates to your question about a sundown town is the South has a very deep and dark history that we've never really addressed, right?
Exactly.
And the reason why we're seeing some of the same problems is because, in the South, we have this mindset, too often that if we don't talk about it, it'll go away. And there's a quote that says, and Malcolm X said it, he said, if you stick a knife in me 9 inches and you pull it out 6, that didn't heal it. He said, you have to pull it out all the way and then heal my wound before we can begin to heal as a community.
One of the things that I have been thinking about is living in the South and coming from the North and being in the South.
Yes, ma'am.
It is kind of imposed on you as a white woman without any, like you say, any conversation. And it is like an invisible force around you, but you have no context for it.
Okay.
Don't have any stories. We don't have any. I spent a week at the National Peace Museum in Montgomery, working there and trying to ingest all of this. The tears that just would come up is just phenomenal. And then I related it to the genocide, which is what it is. The genocide of so many people. Do you know, in the 20th century, there were over 260 million people that were killed globally through genocide.
Didn't know that.
Can you believe it?
It's a lot of people.
20th century. And the African American community is one of it. So there's something in our humanity that wants to wipe out the other. I think we need to talk about all of this within a broader perspective to say, how does hate in our society get such a place that you can tell me that if I went up to you and shot you in the middle of the street, I'd be fine?
A fun time. It's never a dull moment.
Well, I would like to let everybody know we're listening to Daniel Blackman. This is the WCEG Talk Radio, and I am your host, Reverend Diane Doherty. And we're listening to, the show is called Take a Stand, and we've heard so many stories about how Daniel has really taken a stand on issues. And to such a degree, he's running to become the chairperson of the Democratic Party. When is the election?
January 26th. And, it's a state committee vote, so it's not a traditional election where people will be able to anybody can come out and vote. I wish it was, because we've got a lot of great support. But what I'll say about that is that the reason why it's important, if you are in any of the 159 counties in the state of Georgia, your voice matters. It will be held in Atlanta, Georgia on January the 26th. It will be held early in the morning. You have to be there to vote. But I would encourage every single county, whether you have a vote or not, to be a part of the democratic process, because if you feel neglected, if you feel like you're hopeless. I was in Rabun County, Georgia 3 times last year. Rabun County sits on the Georgia-Tennessee line. Rabun County, Georgia, in this past election cycle did not have one Democrat run for office, and they're in a part of our state that they're so far away from the happenings of Atlanta that they don't feel like they're part of the conversation. But when I went out there and spoke, 300 people showed up.
Whoa,
and,
Daniel.
and these individuals, and it wasn't just because I showed up there, they want to be engaged. They want to make phone calls. They want to knock on doors. But we've got to now be able to bring them into the fold. So whether you live in Rabun or Valdosta or Albany, Georgia, or you live in Savannah, Georgia, we need people around this state to understand that your voice matters. And it starts right here. It doesn't start when a candidate like Stacey Abrams or Sarah Miko, puts their name on the ballot. It starts a year before you know who they are. Because if it takes Barack Obama being on the ballot for you to be inspired, then that means when he's not on the ballot, you're going to stay at home. But
That's
if we
true.
can encourage people throughout the year and say, hey, what is your issue? Like when I ran for the Public Service Commission, I didn't run so much on Plant Vogel as much as I ran on people's paychecks and their checkbooks. Why? Because you shouldn't have to choose between keeping food on the table or paying your light bill, right? And we have to humanize the issues we're trying to get people to show up at the polls for. So in order for us to address these issues in the state, when this election happens, when I'm running for chair, and if you're a state committee member, I would love your support. But the reality of it is, whether you're a state committee or not, state committee member or not, you need to be there to see and to hear the vision that folks are putting out, and they need to be able to tell you exactly what they're going to be able to do to bring Georgia together. And that's why that 5 Georgia plan is important. It's in Atlanta, Georgia. I'll have the details up on my website with the time and the location and everything. I don't want to misspeak, but they can change the location anytime due to numbers. And I want to make sure that we have it set in stone, and I have the correct information to share with your listening audience.
Who else is running?
Nikema Williams is running. Well, she's the only other one that has announced. And, I've known Nikema for a long time. I just think that I have a better vision that I want to offer up, and I don't think that takes away from anyone. I mean, I hope to see 5, 6, 7 candidates running for president in 2020 to give us multiple perspectives. But at the end of the day, I hope they do what Abraham Lincoln did. There's a book called Team of Rivals. And what Abraham Lincoln did was when he got elected, everyone that was in opposition to him, he brought into his cabinet. And he said, we're going to solve these problems together. So while Nikema is running, I believe that what separates me from Nikema is, number one, I feel that there is a certain capacity around the state that I've been able to see firsthand. I've lived in Columbus, Georgia. I've lived in Savannah, Georgia. I've lived in Atlanta. I've lived in Marietta. I've lived in Forsyth. And I understand from not just visiting, but from listening to what folks are talking about, the issues we have. And I think it's going to be incumbent for the next person to lead the Democratic Party to have not only a vision, but to be able to dedicate the whole of their time to make sure that in 2019 and in 2021, we're prepared. The reason why I use those 2 years is because we need to be ready before 2020, and we need to be ready to roll up our sleeves and get back to work the day after the election, regardless of the outcome, because it's a marathon and not a sprint, and we've got a lot of work to do.
How about Stacey Abrams? Is she endorsing you?
No, Stacey hasn't endorsed me. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if Stacey likes Nikema because they have been colleagues. They've worked together. But what I'll say is, Stacey is a generational talent, and I've got other support around the state. Regardless of what Stacey's decision is, she hasn't publicly endorsed anyone yet. But in the event that Nikema receives an endorsement, because she has gotten a lot of support from the AJC and from some of our statewide leadership, and has seemingly become the heir apparent to DeBose Porter, who's our outgoing chair. But what I would push back and say is that it's very easy for us to allow folks to look at who we think should be there when we leave. And the same example I gave about Obama, I'll give about Stacey. We all would have liked to see Stacey become governor of the state of Georgia. But if we build our parties around individuals, then when those individuals are not here, we're not inspired.
That's right.
And for me,
that's right.
I have gone around the state, and I have not only helped to identify leadership, but build leadership in the civil rights and human rights space, but also in political activism. And the evidence is, seen in many areas that we've been able to build. If you look at, I'm chair of the 7th Congressional District. We had a phenomenal candidate that did not have the star power that Stacey had, but she came 411 votes away from being in a runoff, and that's Carolyn Bordeaux, in the 7th Congressional District.
Unbelievable.
And so we have a lot of talent in Georgia that, and again, regardless of who gets behind Nikema, what I would tell everybody is, let's look at the issues and look at what the person is saying they want to do.
I think Bush called it strategery. Strategery. Bush should have his own dictionary. I think. I think he has a whole vocabulary I like
that he created.
Word, though, strategery.
Yeah, but I mean, but there are clear differences, and I would like people to look at dpg.vote, which is our site. We have our plan, and we're building a lot of good things. In the next couple of days,
Blue Topsy.
Yeah, well, that's the podcast. The podcast has been fun.
The podcast is called Blue Topsy.
Mm-hmm.
And you can go to it at blueberry.com.
Yeah, or you can just look us up on Facebook, Twitter, or social, or Instagram, any of our social media networks. My great, phenomenal co-host Eric Cohen. We started off back in in August of this year. I mean of 2018, and the reason why. So Blue Topsy, for everybody to know, Eric and I sat down and we said we wanted to do an autopsy of the Democratic Party of Georgia.
I love it.
So it's a Blue Topsy, right?
I love
and
it.
what we said, why haven't Democrats won in 18 years? And we wanted to ask people. So we interviewed Jason Carter and we interviewed Sarah Amico. And then we said, well, what we want to know about what's going on in rural parts of our country. So we got Governor Steve Bullock, who I really like, and I hope he throws his name in the hat for 2020. But Steve Bullock won in a state that Trump won by 20 points. The only Democratic governor to win in a state that Trump won.
Washington.
No, he's Montana. He's in Montana. Yeah, Governor Inslee, who was on our show, is from Seattle. So in a 6-month period, Eric and I have been able to hear from some of the greatest political minds in Georgia and in our country. We've had a good friend, Sarah Amico, visit us on multiple occasions, who ran a great campaign for lieutenant governor. She's a businesswoman, and she's someone that has dedicated her life to really helping folks understand the importance of organizing and of having their voices heard around the state. And I hope Sarah stays out there because she did us proud in Georgia, and she would have made a tremendous lieutenant governor, and I'm happy to call her a friend.
There are 13 episodes.
Yeah.
And you can just sit down and listen to them all night long.
You can. And we even have one show, before we move on, we even have one show where, so something we do differently on our podcast is we don't just interview great and inspiring people. We also give our perspectives, and we let people know that our perspective isn't talking points from a state party apparatus or from anything that, we're trying to push out there. We give our honest, unfiltered, unapologetic opinions to let people know that we're out here to give a perspective that everyone can buy into. And when people, email us or reach out to us on social media, we allow their opinions and also, their pushback to be a part of our conversation.
Cool. Well, I wanted you to end this by talking about the conference you just came back from.
Yeah.
Which is phenomenal. And I'm going to show this book. I think I can hold it up.
It's a pretty big book.
It is. And, did we get it? Yes. Well, I can't read it though. What does it say? Memories
of the Southern Civil Rights Movement. It was actually a gift given, and it's the forward is by Julian Bond. But I was very privileged to have been in Sunnylands, California. Invited by the Annenberg family. We had a chance to go out to a property where Barack Obama held his summit with the president of China. To me, it's kind of like a Camp David of California, right? And you've had everyone from dignitaries, the royal family has been there from the UK, Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon. I mean, it goes back decades of a place for the leadership and the sharing of ideas of leaders. And, what happened was so amazing for me. We had great people like Joan Baez, who was a singer and activist, and we had Taylor Branch, who's a historian, phenomenal guy you should look up. We had one of the original Little Rock Nine, that was there, Mr. Claiborne Carson, who has documented all of the information that has been through the history of Dr. King. A lot of stuff we don't know about. David Goodman was there, whose brother Andrew Goodman was the brother that I mentioned earlier that was killed. Jonathan Greenberg, who teaches at Stanford, he is founding up the Gandhi King Institute. And the last person that I'll name is a gentleman named Clarence Jones. Clarence Jones was the convener. Clarence called everyone from Harry Belafonte and Zernona Clayton to C.T. Vivian and Joseph and Reverend Gerald Durley here in Atlanta. Andrew Young was there, and unfortunately, Mr. Belafonte could not make it, and our great sister here, Zernona Clayton, couldn't make it. She had some issues she was dealing with privately. But today I attended a funeral of Reverend Cameron Alexander. And when I moved to Atlanta, Jesse Hill, who was an architect of building Atlanta, and Maynard Jackson and, Coretta Scott King, they were all living.
See, I love that.
Yeah.
Architects who built Atlanta.
They built it. And people like the Reverend James Orange, who many people might not know and may not remember, but these individuals embraced me early. And the thing that I regret most, my father died 8 months after Reverend Orange, and they were two pillars in my life. And the thing I regret most than anything as an adult is I didn't pick their brains as much as I feel that I should have. So what I've been so privileged to be a part of over the last 20 years is to have been one of very few people in this country that has access to the Reverend Lowrys and the
I know.
Claibornes.
You're correct. You're correct. They should all be on that WABE.
Yeah. The eyes on the
Radio Lab.
Oh yeah. I'm familiar with that. But I think the thing that I took out more than this is not just about calling their names and the John Lewises of the world, but it's about us understanding that there is a tremendous disconnect in this country that, in my opinion, could really be the answer to racism and hatred and bigotry in our country, and that's intergenerational communication.
That's
right. The stories that were told from black and white, Jewish and Christian, Muslim and atheist, singer, songwriter, and activist. These stories have been buried and the more the internet grows, the less our capacity for learning becomes desirable, right? And so I'm in a position now where I've been very fortunate to have shared conversations with these individuals. The story of the 1964 Voting Rights Act was so clearly articulated through people that were in these rooms. And I think for me to be effective as a leader, if I'm privileged enough to become chair of the Democratic Party of Georgia, is, the understanding where we came from. It's not just about the civil rights leaders that were in Atlanta. There are a lot of folks that helped to push this movement in other parts of Georgia that really are their voices. The farmers that are down in Albany and in Dougherty County. I mean, there are folks that helped to build this apparatus. And there were 33 black men that were elected to the Georgia legislature during Reconstruction, and we don't talk about that. We don't talk about the history and the achievements of people of color that are here. And I think if we know and embrace our history, it will be able to allow us to be more effective when we're targeting communities of color, because black folks in Georgia can't save the Democratic Party without white folks and Latino folks and other people around this state. We need each other, and to separate our histories rather than embrace what we did that was great and what worked. If we walk away from the things that made us good, we
don't tell the stories.
We don't.
I was listening to Bernice, who told this story about her mother. Her mother told her. But when the Nobel Peace Prize was won by
Dr.
King, the saddest thing happened because Atlanta was not going to celebrate it because it was segregationist at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Who stepped in was the Archbishop of Atlanta.
Wow.
Bishop Hallinan. He's from my hometown. My mother and he were schoolmates. He and the rabbi at the temple got together.
It's powerful.
And they said, you have to do something. So they petitioned to who owned Riches at the time?
I don't remember. I don't know.
The guy that owned Riches, and also Woodruff, the Koch.
Yeah, the Woodruff family.
The Woodruff family. So the Woodruff family took a stand, and he said, Atlanta needs Coke, but Coke doesn't need Atlanta. We're not going to have a Nobel Peace Prize winner in our city and not honor him.
And a shameless plug is I sit on the board of Callenwald, which is the house that was owned by the Candler family. And that story is absolutely true. And again, that goes to the stories we don't share, because the Candler family was the very reason why Dr. King was able to be honored at that time. So I think those stories are critical and they're very important.
And it was there was a hotel. Was it Dillon or Dickards?
Yeah, I don't want to misspeak and
I don't either. But anyway, the people that owned these businesses, these small businesses, there were like 5 of them that came together, and that is how Atlanta became desegregated
Mm-hmm.
for the first time. But it had to do with this Nobel Peace Prize.
But if you think about it, though, you're right, like the honor, the
Those are the
irony.
stories that we need to tell.
Well, they are, but like I remember, there's a great book that if you're living in Atlanta or you want to understand how Atlanta went through this movement, read Where Peachtree Meets Sweet Auburn, right? That book talks about how race played a role in the balance of power. But here's the thing. If you think about what was our old slogan in Atlanta, right? Because it is a clear indication
See,
of how
I'm
we
not
dealt
from
with it.
Atlanta. I don't know
So
what it was.
we were called the city too busy to hate.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
But when you think about what that actually means, it didn't say hate was bad. It just said we're too busy to hate, right? So I think we have to look historically at how relationships were managed in the South during that time. The group that I was able to meet with, they taught me how they navigated through Jim Crow era laws and how
I
they
just love to
navigated
hear
through
that.
all these
I'd love
areas.
to come.
So
I'd love to
it was
hear more about
powerful,
it.
and I think we need to understand how and what people had to go through to be able to be where we are.
I agree with you. We need a great storytelling
Yes, ma'am.
for this next generation so that they can tell their own stories.
I agree.
No hate. I'd like to tell everybody we're listening to Daniel Blackman, who is running to become the chairperson of the Democratic Party. I'm Reverend Diane Doherty. This is Take a Stand. And in closing, I wanted to let
It's been
people
by quick.
I know, it just goes like this. I wanted to let everybody know that on the 21st of January, there will be an MLK rally and march that is joined by both the Women's March as well as all the social justice activists in Atlanta. The Georgia Alliance for Social Justice, giving it a plug, if you go to their cover, is talking about the Women's March from last year. And as opposed to having a big march, where there is going to be one in Washington, D.C., they decided that it would be more advantageous to join the communities that are already in existence, especially MLK.
Yeah.
Now, I am so excited because I'll be in Africa at the time, in South Africa, and I will be joining the Women's March in South Africa,
Take
in
pictures.
Johannesburg. And I'm also going to be participating in the ordination of the first Roman Catholic woman priest
Wow.
in Johannesburg.
The world is changing.
The world is changing, and as many of you know, I am a Roman Catholic woman priest, and this is the stand that we take as women, where we understand our call, we understand the work that we've done to get where we are at this time, and we have to say that there is not going to be a road that blocks us, that we find a way to go around it, above it, or possibly through it, with the help of our brothers and sisters. And so we would love everyone to join Daniel in his enthusiasm and pray for him.
Yeah.
Bring him that energy and bring us all to a space and a place where we can see that old Atlanta that had so many roadblocks that kept us far from each other melds into not we don't want a melting pot. We don't want to invest to such a degree that we become each other, because that just defeats the purpose. What we want to do is maintain our own dignity and giftedness and become a Georgia that never has been seen before. It's new. It's like the death. From death we are rising. So I wondered if, Daniel, you would have any closing remark, and then also add to it when we can when the voting is happening.
Yeah.
And do they they're sending representatives from the 159 counties, right?
Well, state committee members are representative of our state. Every county may not have